Well, why don't we go ahead and kick things off? I know people are still joining. So I'm so excited about today's webinar, but my name is Rhonda Grimm. I'm president of NCJW San Antonio, and I am thrilled today to have with us Honorable Judge Melanie Lira. I have known Melanie since 2016 and truly instantly knew like this woman is one to watch, and not to brag, but I was so right. A little bit about Judge Lira. She was born and raised in San Antonio, Texas, the firstborn citizen in her family, which gives her a unique perspective on the hardships of migrant life and the pressures of first generation citizenship. At 16, she started college locally and then transferred to the University of Houston, graduating with a bachelor's degree in art history and religious studies. She's then accepted to the University of Denver Iliff School of Theology's graduate program, where she began working with nonprofits that assisted the undocumented community, witnessing firsthand the importance of legal advocacy. Upon graduation, she packed her bags, moved to San Antonio, and was accepted into the St. Mary's School of Law and graduated in 2015. And while attending law school, she earned her second master's degree in international relations with a focus on conflict resolution, and graduating in the top 5% of her class. So over the course of her career, Melanie has been committed to human rights and social justice, both domestically and internationally. Over the years, she's worked with nonprofits to help Syrian refugee children. And in 2015, she received the Alice Wright Franksy Feminist Award and the Justice Alma Lopez Women in Law Leadership Award. She's worked as an immigration staff attorney, served as a Bexar County appointed attorney, and an immigration attorney at her own firm, Lira, where 40% of her cases are reserved for indigent respondents and offered pro bono. In November 2022, Melanie was elected as judge for County Court 7. So let's get started. By the way, if you have any questions, you feel free to put them in the chat. And then we'll also have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to Judge Melanie Lira.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Rhonda. I'm so happy to be here. I am very excited. If you can tell from my bio, this is the stuff that I live for. So bear with me, as this topic is so large and there's so many areas of it. So I truly tried to find some of the more talked about issues of immigration, and on top of that, some current issues that we're seeing that you might have some conversations about. Sometimes I think even bringing it back to the basics really helps, so that way you have a really great foundation when discussing this topic with other individuals. So with that, we'll get started. Let me see. I was having some technical difficulties. There we go. All right, so what we're going to go over today is just some basic of what is immigration, who's coming, when are they coming, why are they coming, a little bit of the comparative history that we've seen over the last 100+ years, some common misconceptions and misinformations. We will lightly touch on immigration processes and types of status somebody can have. Those will be kind of sprinkled in throughout the presentation because you'll hear them over and over again. I do really encourage you to engage and ask questions if you want a little bit more clarity, as this is something that I talk about pretty frequently and it is very new for some of you. And so please let me know if you need a little bit more clarity before I move forward. And the last but not least was just a little fun way to engage with the crowd on some of the common sayings that you hear from people when they're either completely unaware of immigration or they have a very hard stance of anti-immigration. So I wanted to also give you some framework of information that you can provide the next time you hear some of these common anti-immigration rhetorics. So we're going to start with the great, 3 immigration waves that we've seen from 1840 until now. And as you can tell, that we did have a smaller amount of immigration movement back in the 1800s compared to as we are today, with now in 2025, the bulk of what we see in immigration processes is the majority coming from Latin America, half of that being from Mexico. As you know, we're a border country with Mexico along with Canada. So we're definitely going to see that higher population residing here and coming over into the United States. So we have that at about 72 million individuals. And if you are a graph person, I always like to throw in some pictures here. So this gives you the percentage of where we are as of 2023. We're at a 14.3% of our population currently is considered an immigrant population. So I'm going to touch base on this slideshow, but also give you a little bit of a conversation on the outside of this. So about 120, I think it's closer to 122 million people displaced worldwide. I use displaced versus undocumented or refugees because there are a multitude of situations that cause migration from one place to another, whether it's moved with the intent of becoming a permanent person in that new country, or if it's a temporary issue given for, your country is currently in war, as we saw with Syria, or if there is a climate issue. So, I'm going to use that as in a general term. However, domestically, we are at about 11 people in the United States as of now that would fall under the scope of immigrants. That's about 14.3 of the total US population. It is a rise over the last, what is that, 50 years, 55 years. However, we're still under where we were at our highest peak back in 1890. Now, to the left, you see the breakdown of who that is coming into the country. That's kind of the constant question. I think it's very normal to hear mainly Mexico, again, because it makes up the large amount of individuals coming into the country. However, we do see the breakdown in other countries as well. And now this isn't just undocumented individuals. So this is kind of where I wanted to give you a little bit more of that insight, because it's not just, I think, people think you just crossed illegally into the country and everyone's in that group. These are individuals that could have come in off of certain kind of investor visas, work visas, could have come in on fiancé visas, walked in as residents, have come to the country already as a refugee versus an asylee. And we'll dive into that just as we go a little bit further through the presentation. But this gives you some nice graphics to kind of see where we are between domestic born and foreign born and what that makeup of those populations are. So one of the reasons people do come, and this is more of my pet project, one of the things that we didn't list in this bio, I just finished receiving my certification through the University of London for migration protection and refugee studies. One of my biggest projects was how climate change has truly made an impact on immigration. And why that is such a big deal for us is currently under this administration, if you've been following closely, which I have a feeling a lot of you have been, we've seen movement and discussion into climate change and whether it's real or not real, removing ourselves from particular agreements, mainly the Paris Agreement. We've seen just in the last couple of years, for instance, when Gaziantep received that massive earthquake in an area of Turkey, which is very closely bordered to Syria, a lot of displaced individuals were already being hosted in that area. And now you compounded that destruction with a natural disaster, which then caused, where do we relocate now these individuals? So climate change does have a direct effect on how we're going to see patterns move. And I believe right now we're closely about 130 million people currently displaced due to climate change issues. So in 25 years, it is projected that we'll be at about 216 million people. So almost doubling in just a short amount of time. So I think that it's a true testament to how we are navigating climate change issues politically. And I think that does trickle down to your ballot when you are considering who to vote for, who supports these kinds of positions, because then at that point you can have a semi-direct impact on how you want your country to contribute to our climate change crisis overall. Especially, I think individuals don't tie those two together as a problem between climate change and migration. But here you can clearly see the areas of impact and how many people are going to be displaced further in just a short amount of time. 25 years is not a lot to accumulate that many people. And that's just due to climate change. That's not due to any kind of other issues, economic factors, violence factors. So those are one of the 3 top areas that you would see people relocate for. So that why are they coming? Climate change is one of them, predominantly and more discussed for purposes of just being around is going to be violence, gang violence, extortion, government corruption, gender-based violence. Those are going to be a lot of the reasons why we see individuals leave their country in search of a new place. When I was practicing as an immigration defense attorney, my primary focus was asylum and was, gender-based issues, violence issues throughout the world. So this is an area too that it's kind of double-edged swords. It's kind of horrible to say you're fascinated with it because it's terrible, but at the same time, it's an area that you increasingly have to be very aware of. So with that said, we're going to move over, and this is kind of where I encourage a little bit more engagement if you guys have questions. These are quick bullet points because I wanted to go over some of this. Myths and misinformation, or rather just confusing, verbiage. Non-citizens, I think a lot of times people assume a non-citizen automatically equals an undocumented individual. So I want to clarify that a non-citizen can be somebody who came into the country lawfully as a green card holder, aka a legal permanent resident, and has been here working completely under the law, abiding by everything. That individual would not be considered a citizen. However, they are still here lawfully. We have that range all the way down to an individual who comes into the country under a tourist visa or a specific investor visa, or for students who come in who work on a student visa, which technically that student visa wouldn't allow an avenue in and of itself to become a resident without another mitigating factor. But that individual would not be here unlawfully, would actually have very similar benefits as somebody with a resident. They would be allowed to work, they would have a license, they would be under all of those same benefits with some mild limitations, such as they would only be allowed to work at the school versus in general. So I just kind of want to bring it to your attention that when you hear non-citizen, I would actually encourage you to use non-citizen versus undocumented, migrant, immigrant, and of course I would never encourage anybody to use the term illegal. But that is the verbiage that we hear mainly. So when you hear that, just consider that somebody may not be a citizen, but may be here completely documented, very legal, but they're just not at that citizenship stage. So I'm going to just jump down slightly, which is this green card versus citizenship. So you often hear, and it kind of ties with, prong number 3 there, just apply for your citizenship, or they want to apply for their citizenship. We have levels of which you have to attain before you can reach citizenship status. Generally speaking, one of them will be applying for your residency, which is your legal permanent resident. That's your green card. That is the same thing. That's why I put green card versus resident. Those are the same thing. So you can either use green card. It used to be on a green card. The document is very different now, but back in the day, it was nice and green. So it just kind of became a quick known thing. And that's where green card is coming from. But that is a legal permanent resident. Now, depending on how you receive that status, you would then be able to apply for your next step, which is citizenship. So you do have to be in this area majority of the time before you can apply for citizenship status. There is a rare exception, and we'll dive into that a little bit later. But for the majority of individuals applying for citizenship, they were usually a resident prior to that. So when somebody wants to become a citizen, it's not just a quick jump. There is a whole second process after already being vetted for the residency status. They would be vetted yet again. Of course, passing your test, making sure that you can answer all of your questions, read and write in English, speak in English, all of those things. So that would be that last step. Now, when I put marriage versus or citizenship, a lot of people just assume that if you marry someone who is a domestic born citizen, then you can automatically become a citizen. That is also a massive misinformation and myth. It is possible, but there are other factors that have to be met before you can also reach that status of application. So for a quick one, for instance, you have to have come into the country legally through some form, whether it was a tourist visa, fiance visa, it could be a student visa, as we discussed before, some form of visa that gives you a lawful entry coupled with your petition process, which is that it's a qualifying person who can now apply for your citizenship or your adjustment status, which is green card area, right? So legal permanent resident. So there are two things that need to coexist in order to move forward. If that does not exist, then therefore there is no straight path that is linear. There is an option, but it's very different. It has a very high burden to be met, and not everyone will qualify in that instance. So I would like to note that if you hear that, well, they're just going to marry citizens and it's just going to, they're coming here in floods and they're just going to have babies and marry people and we can't stop them. We need to find a new way to stop them. There has been, and I mention that because there has been conversation and rumors circulating amongst the immigration defense attorney community discussing that USCIS or the administration is seeking to remove the ability for a non-citizen to apply for a green card through their spouse. That while we have the right to marry whomever we choose, that you do not have that right to extend your citizenship to that other individual. So this has been kind of quiet for now. I think some attorneys are keeping their eyes on this to see if that would happen. But this is a big area to be highly concerned about because it would inherently split families apart. It would create an even larger backlog, a more of a fiscal challenge for our country, as we would then have to process these people through removal proceedings, which is also known as deportation proceedings. And we would see a massive increase of camps. So it would not be a really good area for us to face, especially as attorneys dealing with this issue. So I'm going to see, I don't think there's any questions just yet. So going into the right way, that's something that we'll talk about a little bit more, I'm sure, throughout this presentation, but the right way is a unicorn. In a very perfect world, I am a Mexican citizen who decided to apply to college. I moved to New York to the school of my dreams with my visa, and I met the love of my life while at school. We decided to get engaged, we get married, and now I want to apply for my residency process. That should be fairly simple. That is a very clean, straightforward. They have that legal entry. They now have that individual who can petition for them because of the marriage. And now they can go about that process. That is a very clean, nice, beautiful case that we all love to hear as attorneys because it's just simple. However, that's not the case the majority of the time. You have to remember that historically speaking, we kind of had just a turning table of the, that turning door, that revolving door that we all go through when it came to how we came into this country to work, we leave this country to send money back home, we come back into this country to work for another few months in farming areas. That has now changed quite a bit. And so what has happened is you got stuck on either side of the door. So it increased what we saw unlawful entries, but it also allowed, it kept people here who were used to the in and out, be able to work in agriculture and leave. So a lot of these individuals don't have this proof of entry the way that some might have nowadays, given that there's a little bit more transparency and structure to what would be required for you if you are seeking something more in the future. So I wanted to kind of just point that the right way is not always that easy. Even if there's an individual, for instance, who is a citizen, but their brother is not, and they're from Mexico, what we have is something called the Visa Bulletin, which gives attorneys direction as to which petitions can move forward. And just to give you some perspective, that time frame where an individual in that brother sister scenario would not be able to apply for anything for about 20 plus years. So it's not a very quick process. Being related or married to somebody, it's not an easy thing. And meanwhile, that individual is waiting in home country that entire time. Now, obviously, hardships can present themselves when discussing that if they're in a country that is facing war or other types of violence, then the urgency and the need to come might be a lot higher than other individuals, say Switzerland, who is fairly calm and a very nice place to be. So it could be a little bit of a different situation for those individuals. So let's just continue on with that scenario and say brother got tired of waiting. The violence in his country has just begun to increase substantially. He's been targeted. Let's call him a gay brother. He's been targeted for being homosexual and is now fearing for his life. He now can go to the border and at the border tell an officer, I have fear to return to my home country. I am fearing persecution. And at that point, that is what we would call claiming asylum. So right at that point, it is our duty then to take that individual in and have what we call a reasonable fear interview, or well, excuse me, it's got credible fear interview at this point to see if there is an actual fear of persecution in that instance. So this is kind of getting a little bit into the weeds, but your administration also dictates what is good enough for a fear. And we used to tell our clients, unfortunately, immigration is that area where bad news is great news. I loved when somebody came in with photos that were horrific to look at, scars, medical records. You wanted extreme pain and harm to that individual because that was the only way this person was going to be deemed credible. Now, I don't know about you guys, but if you're in the middle of something that's extremely violent, I don't know how many people would gather photos and evidence and information. I don't know if their mind is kind of thinking about that at the moment, or they're just ready to grab their stuff, grab their kids, close on back and run. So it presents quite an issue when attorneys are representing these individuals who are faced with an administration that is restricting the ability for these individuals to prove up their case. So we'll get into that slightly, but not too much unless we want to talk about this later on in the future, or if you guys have another question, because there's quite a bit. Now, I do know that there are some confusion when it comes to refugee versus asylee status. Refugee status is done outside, so it's not in country. When you're applying for asylum status, you will be in the country. Refugee status will be outside. So they are in another country, they're seeking refugee in that country through our consulate there, and then they will come in or leave their country as a refugee. So status already granted, essentially. We use those words very interchangeably, but in the international treaties and our laws, they're very much separated. So if you guys have, I'm just checking, I don't think so. If you have any other questions on clarifying that a little bit more, we definitely can talk about that. At the very end of this presentation, I do list a bunch of resources on there that you guys can have if you also are like us and love to hear more and more. So common misinformation, we've touched on it briefly, and that was more of just the vocab that's being used and how to better figure out which words pertain to which situations, especially when you're in a conversation with somebody who is, unwilling maybe to hear a certain side. It can give you a little bit more of just like a factual definition of what these things are. This next area is going to be a little bit more of what we hear during campaign trails for anyone, not just, presidential campaigns, but anyone who may be a little bit more conservative leaning pertaining to immigration. And for you guys here watching, if the majority of you are from Texas, you're going to hear that, triple the amount that somebody else in Midwestern places are, because we do have that border, and it is a constant weaponized area between the political parties when it comes to border security. And that's generally something that a candidate would run on a conservative leaning side. So they're all murderers and rapists. We've heard this for quite some time now, that everyone who's coming in is essentially a criminal. So I wanted to include the border stats. This is from the government pages themselves, that show the encounters with these individuals throughout the last 8 years or so. So from 17 moving on to date, as of March. Now, you see 2024 has 17,048. So yes, there is an increase in criminal arrest. So I wanted to make sure that you guys had this slide, which breaks down the type of offenses that a lot of these individuals are charged with. And I would ask you to look down here. I think you can see possibly my cursor, where this large amount of 10,935 apprehensions in 2024 alone. That was due to illegal and re-entries. So that is a criminal offense. We have that face on the federal end, and that is the majority of the individuals that are being apprehended. So for instance, a person decides to leave the country, whether it's voluntary or not, they come back into the country because they've changed their mind and they are caught at that point of entry. That would be one of these numbers in these stats. So I do feel like I must point out that the rapist and the killers, all the murderers, we're at about 29 individuals that had offenses in that area for 2024 alone. So no, when you're looking at a 17,000 of apprehensions and offenses, but only 29 of those are actually of homicide, those stats really don't line up. The information is coming straight from the government themselves, and it's right here. Now, we do see an additional, which as before I even saw the breakdown, I had to assume if this would be a top one, which is driving under the influence, Texas law, driving while intoxicated. You see that they're at 2844 of individuals with those offenses in 2024. So those are our peak ones. Other could just be criminal trespass, evading arrest. It could be something that's probably more of a Class B or A misdemeanors, which are not inherently as dangerous as we would be facing. You see a lot of petty theft, anything under $100. A lot of that is pretty common when it comes to these types of cases in the other bracket. So next, we're going to move. Okay, so I thought this was really interesting. This is a study out of Texas, and they decided to use Texas again, given because our close proximity to the border. So with this, they have now seen that US born citizens are 10 times more likely than immigrants to be incarcerated for committing a weapon related offense, 5 times more likely for a violent offense, and more than twice likely for property crimes, and nearly twice as well as for drugs and other kinds of substances. So it's really interesting that the propaganda that you're hearing a lot of the time concerning why you do not want or support individuals coming into this country is because they're all violent offenders. And yet the majority of that is not coming from this demographic. It's actually coming from our own domestic homegrown individuals, which we still are with 14% of the population. That's still a really large percentage to have these kinds of stats. So you can see here on the graph below, this one is unique to Texas alone. The information that I just given to you on the left-hand side in that text is throughout the nation. On the right side, this is Texas specific, where you see that US born citizens are more likely to commit certain offenses than undocumented or documented individuals. Now, I will keep in mind that the conversations that we're having when it comes to these stats, it is very difficult sometimes to get accurate statistics when it's, do they have legal status? Do they don't? Texas is the only place that actually documents that. So these stats should be pretty spot on. Generally speaking, when it comes to the rest of the nation, they don't have that same order to where you have to differentiate whether the individual who is a non-citizen is also here with some form of legal documentation or not. So when they do studies, they tend to loop them all together in a lump and say that just immigrants in general, and not necessarily differentiate between the two. But luckily for Texas, we have this really nice clear graph that will show you the differences between the documented and the undocumented community. So again, that orange line could include somebody who is a legal permanent resident for 15 years and just picked up their first DWI. That would be in that orange line. All right. So we are going to talk about something that I know Rhonda has a lot of interest in. So there was an interview where Senator Rob Portman of Ohio claimed that only about half of them show up for their court cases, and that only so many of them actually qualify for any form of relief moving forward. So this was a really good area to discuss. Let's say now this individual is in immigration proceeding or is in criminal proceeding. We're going to focus more on the immigration part at this time. But 83% of those non-detained, so out on bond individuals, are attending their hearings. And just to give you some preference, these hearings can take decades to have. So if you're out on bond today, let's say you get out of the facility today, and you live in San Antonio, you are more likely than not to have your very first court setting no sooner than 2027. That is because of the large, well, that is right now because of our new administration and the amount of roundup that we're seeing. So it's causing a lot more pickups when in placements into deportation than we'd seen in some time. But that's also just due to the massive amount of backlog that we have. Also, there was quite a bit of firings that happened recently as well, too. So that has a trickle effect on how many cases a judge can hear a day. So you're going to have an option, though, that despite not going to court, you can still apply for certain kinds of relief while you are pending your very first hearing. So, for instance, you can submit your asylum application, your Convention Against Torture application, withholding, or let's say you are in a weird place where you did, marry a U.S. citizen and you guys already begun that petition process and have that proof. You can begin that process. That gives them, some of these options give you a right to apply to for a work permit. This is not the same as a work visa. This is just a work permit that has limited purposes where you can work, but as soon as your case is disposed of, that purpose is now closed and that work permission is essentially revoked. So it does incentivize individuals to keep going to court. They're going to have this application pending. They're going to be able to work, which means they're also going to be able to get a driver's license, which for me, I think it makes a lot of sense that now we have somebody with a valid Social Security who is going to feel a little bit more comfortable, working confidently, generating the income they need for whatever it is that their families are facing. But also we have somebody now who can not be driving on the roads with not a valid license, but can get that kind of assurance, training, whatever it is that they need. And if you are more fiscally conservative, it also generates revenue, a large amount of revenue for our country, which we'll get into a little bit later. So also about 96% of the individuals are also represented by attorneys. So attorneys keep that communication between the court and the client moving, despite sometimes having long breaks in between hearings. I had a client when I closed my practice at the end of 22 who has been here, I want to say it was either 2006 or 2007, and has still not had her final hearing, and this was in 2022. I believe it's now coming up this year. So we're talking about long periods of time to where things aren't actually being done. And yet those individuals continue to show up because once an application is submitted, there is that incentive to continue to come to court. And these studies from the American Immigration Council have proven this. So I wanted to bring that out to you as well. Now, there are some courts are in the weirdest, remote of areas. Those tend to be the detained courts. And of course, if they're not showing up for court when they're detained, we got bigger problems, right? But that's not the case here. So let's move forward. So let me grab something really quick. All right, next is they're taking our jobs. I wanted to show this nice little pie chart here to show the foreign-born versus domestic percentage of individuals that are working in this country. Now, I would like to point out, yes, we have seen a record high now of the amount of immigrants working in our workforce, but it's not exceeding at a rate that would keep people out of working. As you can see, is the very first stat, the unemployment rate for US foreign workers averages about 3.6%, and that was in 2023, which was the lowest record. So even though we have a large amount of individuals who are working in this, they're still not taking all of your jobs. And I thought it was, sorry, I gotta plug my computer in. I thought it would be really important to note too, that the types of jobs that these individuals are occupying are not generally the ones that people who are domestic born would want. You see a lot of that as construction, transportation, farm workers. We've seen a lot of those videos circulating throughout the last 6 months, given our admin change. So a lot of the work is labor intensive, it's hard work. So you don't really see a need that is being taken by immigrants. The opposite has been happening when it comes down to the fact that the raids are causing farmers to actually panic and not have this kind of employment coming through, which I'll provide you some more stats here moving forward. So with the amount of raids that we've been seeing and removals of individuals, there's predictions that we will lose a substantial amount of individuals in certain professions moving forward. You see about 135 related in the healthcare by 2036, because they currently fill about 15.6% of those positions. Again, this isn't just undocumented people in these fields. These are green card holders. These are student people. These are DACA. A lot of DACA actually works in these areas. So we would lose that because as we've been seeing right now in current administration changes, there used to be a safety if you were here with a legal visa or if you were here as a resident. And now that is kind of blurred. So we also see moving forward that the agricultural sector relies extremely heavily on immigrant labor, with over 25% of the agricultural workers and 54.3% are graders and sorters of agricultural products. So to me, what I see when I see this, even if I'm in the least favorable to immigration, is that these individuals are taking a large load of a work that it didn't seem like it was being filled, period. To the point now that in this year alone, we could face a shortage of 500,000 workers in construction alone, which does have a ripple effect into how things are built. You know, your homes, businesses, highways, all of that will have a massive effect losing. And this will be not even in 2036, but in 2025. So keep in mind too that there is also this conversation that, you know, Mexicans, undocumented people are just labor workers, but they're not all just labor workers. You know, we do have a large percentage of immigrants coming to this community that do own businesses, that do donate large amounts of money to this economy. And those individuals are also at stake as well. So they make up 13.8% of the population. Immigrants represent 1 in 5 entrepreneurs who started business, producing $110 billion in revenue in 2022 alone. So we're not all just talking about the individuals who are working the day-to-day out in the fields, but we're talking about the people who are generating large businesses that are also employing other individuals, such as US citizens, US born citizens. And I wasn't originally going to throw this slide in, but I couldn't help myself. So while we're at it, that's why I named it, while we're at it, taxes. There is constantly a conversation too, that there is this understanding that they're reaping all these benefits, getting food stamps, getting Medicaid. Residents aren't even allowed certain of these benefits. Definitely not undocumented or tourist or student visas. These things are not allowed or offered to these individuals ever. So even if they had a valid social security number versus an I-10, they're pumping money into these programs in which you and I can then redeem the benefits of this, but they can never. So in 2022, $382.9 billion in federal taxes were paid by this community, and $196.3 billion in state and local taxes in 2022 alone. I believe the last time I saw the number for 23, it was in the 400s, but I could not find that stat again. And I wanted to make sure to give you actual things that you can hold on to. So, and those include individuals that are not just working with valid social security numbers, but are also working with I-10 numbers. So if you go and you apply for this I-10, you're able to kind of do these taxes, but you're not ever going to receive anything back from this. Now, keep in mind, I-10, I didn't have it on this slide, but I thought might as well point this out. It's not to be confused with like a social security work situation. Sometimes individuals believe that if you have an I-10, you're legally allowed to work. You don't. So it begs the question, well, why are they doing taxes if they're not working? And that is just because it's a theory, it's a cultural thing that I'm earning my money, I'm going to do my part, I'm going to pay my taxes, knowing that they'll never receive any of these benefits in the long run for the majority of these individuals, especially those with I-10s. So that's like Social Security, Medicaid, all of that, and unemployment. So this one is a personal pet peeve of mine, anchor babies. It's such a derogatory term, and that is referring to an individual who was born to an undocumented or non-citizen, essentially, mother. This one is very bothersome to me too, because as mentioned in my bio, I am the firstborn citizen in my family. I do not consider myself an anchor baby by any means, but it is a term that I've heard repeatedly. As you see there, it became a term that was starting to be used a lot in the 2000s. This is probably my favorite image of all my PowerPoint, primarily because it is so cleverly done, where she is wearing her robe that says birthright citizenship. This has come into question quite a bit throughout the last, 5 months, 3 months. So I wanted to go into what is birthright citizenship. So we do have our constitutionally protected right that if you're born here in this country, you are now a U.S. citizen. That is our just soil Latin term, which means born here, moving forward. I don't know if you remember early on in the presentation, I made a comment about that there's another way you can kind of jump fast to becoming a citizen. That's for those individuals who were born out of this country, but to citizenship parents. That could be military, that could be a couple of other little unique circumstances where, for instance, they lived here their whole life, they were born here, they were citizens, and then they traveled abroad and met someone they loved, and then moved out of the country, and then wind up having a child out there. That parent can still transfer that citizenship over to their child, despite that child not being born in the United States. So that is one of the options that we do have in this country as well. It's not as seen, it's really seen in the military area if they're not born on base, but it's not as common as what we see when you naturalize and you apply for citizenship, or if you're just obviously, like you and I, born in this country. So I also just wanted to point out that birthright citizenship, it is a constitutionally protected right. However, let's just have some fun with the situation and say, okay, conservative individuals, you're right. They're running over here just to have babies because they are ready to become citizens, they're ready to become residents, and they're using these kids as avenues. I want to point out one fact if you take away when you're going and arguing with people about this situation, specifically because this issue is a hot topic currently, is that it's a minimum of 21 years before that parent can reap any benefit from their child. any benefit. So that's not an immediate thing. And it also has to be coupled with that earlier lesson that we had, which is that legal entry. So you have the legal entry, now you have the child, but the child has to be at least 21 years old before they can petition for their parent. So it's not a quick, simple jump. I don't know about you guys, but I don't think I would want to go into a country, have a kid intentionally, just to have to wait 21 years before I can reap any benefit. That sounds very exhausting. So I would like to point out that that is not necessarily true, even if we were to give some, credence to this discussion on a more conservative side, that it still takes some time. So I know we're getting close to wrapping up. So I will leave you with what's going on in current politics. This is a beautiful one. We're updating our will to add provisions in case we're ever sent to El Salvador prison. So it's a little humor, because if we don't have humor, then we all go insane. But as many of you may have heard, we now have an El Salvador, deportation process. Regardless if you're from El Salvador or not, people are being moved over who are deemed dangerous. This is a huge issue. If you've been following the news, it's been a back and forth battle. I'm going to talk about the one individual who this case has really kind of made national news, which is Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who was here legally, given order and permission to remain in the country, no criminal history, who was accidentally picked up along with over 230 other individuals and deported over to El Salvador. And that is where he still remains to this day, despite several orders to produce the individual back to the country. The purpose of what this administration is trying to do with this very public deportation process, I'm used to these photos, but I'm not used to seeing these photos all over news sources, because it's mainly a thing when you practice, immigration. They are producing these photos, one, to deter individuals to either don't come at all, because look what's going to happen, or two, if you're here, get out before this happens to you. So it's a deterrent that it's being used. It's also really nifty for them to use this, because once that individual is out of the country, we lose jurisdiction. So no judge can really order that individual back. So this is a huge problem. Another issue that they're not addressing, because they won't, is the fact that this violates so many international treaties, as we are under an obligation under the Convention Against Torture to not send someone to a place to where we know they will be tortured. This prison is notoriously known for its very harsh punishments. Salvador was one of the worst crime rates for the longest time, and the president has really got a handle on that in this way. So we're talking about torturous styles, how you feel about that situation. That's a dialogue for another day. But deporting individuals without due process is a huge issue, and we should be really concerned, specifically because of the conversations that this could soon be happening to U.S. citizens. So I did include the Alien Enemy Act that we've been hearing about. It's being implemented for this gang group that is coming out of Venezuela, the Tren de Agua. That is a jail Venezuelan group that has produced that gang. And I believe this is being used in order to kind of just, hey, you look like a gang member, you have tattoos, you're probably one of them. Let's round you up and throw you under this 200-year-old law that's been used only during wartime. So I'll leave that with how you feel about it. But what should be concerning to citizens who feel a certain way, whether they're sympathetic or not, is that Trump has said in numerous interviews that, are homegrown problems, essentially, that anyone who he deems as a dangerous, as a terrorist, for instance, he's now calling a terrorist act any attacks on Teslas, that you could be transported over. There's also this conversation about what about citizens who are already in custody, in the incarceration process. We could just move and use their facilities instead, which is why I wanted to add this I think it's a very little known act that Trump actually advocated heavily for himself, which is the First Step Act, which he was requiring that the government try to house inmates closer to family members. That way that family member could visit the inmate. And not only just advocated that it happen, actually put that into action and moved individuals over into different facilities that would allow that felicitation between family members and inmates. So to then do that in 2018 and fast forward now and say, well, you know what, maybe we should just deport these individuals or take the ones that are in custody now and just ship them on over to El Salvador, who is more than happy to take in anyone from any country, which is also a very odd thing to see. But I'm going to leave you with that little bit of a nugget so you can do with that as you wish. This is about the individual that I just spoke to you about of where he is with his process. Today, he still remains in El Salvador, despite the fact that there has been orders. But as I mentioned before, we lack a lot of jurisdiction. So there's just no way we can do this and get into this realm. And it's been said by El Salvador's president that he's not going to send him back. So unfortunately for this guy who has no criminal history, who was rightfully here, already did everything he needed to do, is now facing a really uncertain future and a very public one for that. So with that said, this was a lot of information. This is kind of where it's a great thing to talk fast, but please go talk to your friends, talk to the friends that you may know that they're a little bit one-sided about this conversation, share information. I know there was a large spread yesterday, call to action for House Bill 1554 that is currently being argued today, which would restrict the funds for organizations to assist in applications and not just through deportation process, but to become a resident, to become a citizen. And that would limit it severely. It has taken really, it's grown legs very quickly. They set the hearing Thursday at 6 p.m. for this Monday. So it didn't give a lot of time for people to reach out to senators, but that's a really great way to reach out and do your part in this. And if you ever need any more information or who you can get involved with or want a clear check of whether these organizations are legit, I am always open for those kinds of communications. So with that, Rhonda, I'll turn it back over to see if we have any questions, or yeah, however you'd like to handle that.
Well, this is outstanding. We've got quite a few in the Q&A. Let's see. I'll just read through them really fast. In the Garcia case, I understand he was given a withholding of removal order, which allowed him to live and work in the U.S., and that the government had the option of appealing, which they did not, or they could send him back to any other country other than El Salvador. With that type of order, can the government send him back at any time? And can they do that with no hearing or due process?
So that is correct. He had a withholding of removal, and no, they can't just send him back, especially towards the country in which they already deemed that he was persecuted. That is a massive no-no. And due process was completely violated at that point. And I believe that's why the lawsuit is moving forward. So no.
My niece is married to a Venezuelan man. Pretty sure he has a green card. He went to college here, works for one of the banks. Should we be worried?
I always would say get that individual to become a citizen as soon as possible. As things are progressing right now, it's getting increasingly harder. They're increasing fees. They're making obstacles that didn't exist. So I would say if he's got a rule, if he has no criminal history, then he's been married to her for over 3 years. Get on it and get on it now.
Oh. Regarding the, someone had texted me this question, can you just simply, is the administration, can they just simply ignore these court orders? Like in the case of,
No.
yeah, how does that play out? I mean,
So
what do you think?
yeah, that's a kind of frightening area right now because we're seeing multiple orders just completely be disregarded. We're seeing judges no longer have any authority to order essentially this checks and balances to where, no, you've crossed your line. You cannot do that. That violates the Constitution. And instead, we're seeing a blatant disregard and actually a movement, I believe, towards trying to strip judges of that authority. So it's actually a really frightening place to be at right now. I'm not as cool on the top of the chain of the judges list to where I would would really, really matter up there, but we still see the trickle effect down there. That is an ongoing, much longer conversation that we definitely should have, because it's frightening that we are completely losing our foundation of our checks and balances.
So one of the questions I recently, and I'm trying to be respectful of time here, I recently learned that that they could get Social Security under some conditions after so many years of paying in as getting work credits. Are you familiar with that, or have you heard anything about that?
No, I think that that process begins after they become residents and they move into citizenship process. At that point, we're in a different area. But if they're just simply working into and paying into it now, I don't think that that's correct. I would be, maybe there's like a small caveat. Immigration is very nuanced, but I'm almost certain that it's not. I think it's only when you move forward to those stages where we all kind of reap those same benefits.
And a good friend has a green card and has been waiting over a year to get called in for her citizenship test. Is there recourse? Is there anything to do to speed that up?
So you can always Google USCIS case status update. And when you Google that, click on the first link, input the numbers, and it'll give you, it'll ask you for some biographical information that your form should say. Insert all that information, and then it'll give you a processing time. It normally looks like 15 to 18 months from the date that they received it. Do the math. If you're outside of that processing time, you can then file a request to expedite your case. If you're still within that processing time, unfortunately, you just have to wait.
And we discussed the case of Kilmar Garcia. There were headlines about the children who are being deported. The 2-year-old, it was a headline over the weekend, I believe. So they're getting, I'm not sure how the children get caught up. Is it if the parent is getting swept into these raids, they could elect to leave the child with the US citizen parent, or the one being sent back could take the child as well. I guess that's a choice that they can make. I think in this case, she was breastfeeding and could not leave the child. So.
Yes, so that is a constant thing. It's a rock and a hard place. You either leave your child and separate from them, or you bring them to a country that they don't know, or also they don't know, and it's in a very violent area. So where you now no longer have any resources because you've been building a life here. So that is the only options. We're not allowed to deport citizens. That is a thing. There is no authority to allow that. But again, that conversation has been happening a lot more than not. I kind of glanced over that slide due to time, but yes, those are the two options that families would face.
Okay, and then last question. I think you had talked about getting stuck on the wrong side of the door. This is my question. I remember it used to be you'd have farm workers who would work here for the season, go back and go, and it seemed to be a fairly fluid process. You're saying now that you can really get stuck on one side of the door or the other, that when did we lose that fluidity, would you say?
So we lost that under Clinton when he signed into NAFTA. So when NAFTA kind of was enacted, it stopped that revolving door, which was a known thing that people would come in, work, and it benefited both sides. They got their cheap labor, which that money was taken back home to home country, and we were able to, produce the crops and do everything that we needed to do on our end for us. But that NAFTA shut that down. So what happened was people feared that, well, crap, if this is happening, then I can't come back to support my family. So that's when we started to see in the 90s the height of immigration coming in unlawfully, because there was that agreement and now there's not. So NAFTA, I would encourage you guys to go look at that. It's one of the things that fascinates me the most. But that unfortunately is when we started all of that. That was the one thing I was hoping when I heard rumors that they would pull out of that back in the first term. We'll see if that happens again, but that would allow for that fluid movement to work for 4 to 6 months and then leave and be gone for 4 to 6 months with the assurance that you have a job to come back to and you would be allowed to come back and work again and then leave again.
Well, Melanie, this was wonderful. I know we're out of time. Thank everyone for attending. Judge Lira, you're amazing as always. And we will be posting this entire presentation and recording to the NCJW-SA site. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at rgrimm@pt.net, and I will happily answer them or send them to Judge Lira to answer. And then that's it. But thank you so much for spending your lunch hour with us. And again, Judge Lira, thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I had a great time, and I look forward to hearing from you guys.